Welcome. Welcome to this new Participatory Group program. As you know, this project, supported and funded by the Madrid City Council, led by Professor Marta Lora Tamayo and myself. It involves 50 cities around the world engaged in this participation program. We are incredibly lucky today. It's a fantastic day because Patricia Gabeiras is with us. She's the managing partner of Bufete Gavides and an expert in cultural and participatory law. Patricia, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Antonio. It's truly a pleasure to be in this very interesting academic and television setting. For me, it's an honor, so I'm looking forward to having a little chat with you on this topic and sharing my perspective. I'm in the minority here because you are both PhDs in administrative law, so more pressure for me on set. But the first question is about how the right to cultural participation has evolved over the years. Let's see, what's been put forward above all is the relevance of the right to participation, which has been put on the public agenda, at least here in Spain, right? Until now, perhaps there wasn't much awareness of what cultural rights were. We had a magnificent constitution, if you will. Later, we'll talk about how it's reflected. We had a very, very modern constitution regarding cultural rights, one of the most modern in our environment, perhaps also because it's a relatively modern constitution within the European context. But nevertheless, that constitutional framework has seen little development, not just in terms of cultural rights. Not only has it suffered or enjoyed little development, but also citizens weren't very aware that this category of fundamental rights existed, in part. And well, without being a constitutionalist, there is a hardcore there of the cultural rights that we could call fundamental. It is now being put on the agenda finally. We'll also talk about what the ministry is doing, about the benefits and perhaps the challenges we still have ahead of us based on these initiatives that are currently being implemented. But I think the most important thing is that it has been put on the public agenda of the Ministry of Culture. There's a General Directorate of Cultural Rights which hadn't existed up until now. That's a new development. A state plan for cultural rights is being developed, which is something that had never happened. The Ministry of Culture had never encouraged it. We can perhaps discuss what this cultural rights plan is, what legal nature it will have, how strong it will be to protect those rights, what it will eventually become, because it's still being worked on. A group is working on it, a group of experts, and obviously it's going to be a political instrument. Perhaps it isn't a legal document. It's important to perhaps establish a foundation and a roadmap for how we should continue advancing in the protection and safeguarding of cultural rights in Spain. There's a lot of ground to cover. Precisely for that reason, I was saying that our constitution has beautiful wording, but perhaps we miss the development of the full text. Patricia, the truth is, thank you so much for coming. It's great to see how well you express yourself and how well you showcase this landscape. But I'm thinking about all the cities that are part of our network. And when you mentioned that, I think we were going to get there now, you keep it in mind. But if a small municipality or a autonomous community, a region wants to carry out some program on cultural rights, where should they start? Or what is the concept that you think is most beautiful, most profound to transmit, to convey regarding the right to culture, right? So that the politicians who want to make that agenda can understand where to start. How do you see the initiation of all of these kinds of processes? Well, the truth is that it's a very exciting time for cultural rights in Spain because apart from the fact that within the Ministry of Culture there is now an action plan for cultural rights, which I insist could become a very interesting political moment, establishing the lines of work and the steps to follow. There are also initiatives at autonomous community level. There have been some interesting initiatives, and why are they so interesting? It involves reducing to the normative level, to legislation, the framework of guarantees and institutions that must be recognized in order to give some substance to those cultural rights recognized by our constitution and that currently don't have a strong system of guarantees. In other words, these cultural rights have been developed in the Spanish legal system in a very impulsive, partial, biased, and incomplete manner. On the one hand, we have an artist statute. On the other hand, we have an intellectual property law. On the other hand, we have a patronage law. But there's no complete conception of a public system that establishes what these institutions should be, what funding must be like, and ultimately all the pieces that will effectively guarantee the enjoyment of these fundamental rights and freedoms. I say that we are a very sweet spot in this regard because, for example, the Canary Islands, the autonomous community of the Canary Islands has already approved, also by unanimity of all parliamentary groups, which is very significant, right? The consensus that can be reached in many cases in terms of culture, the law of the public system of culture of the Canary Islands. These laws that recognize culture as a system are essential so that there can be more regulatory developments at lower levels that in the end provide you these guarantees, right? When we talk about the public system and the laws that recognize and regulate the public system, for us, I mean, these types of laws are essential to guarantee cultural rights. And we say it because it's exactly the same with the public health system. We have a public education system where basic laws regulate and govern everything. What the role of the public sector will be, what the role of the private sector will be, how will all the infrastructure and access to education that allow access to healthcare be guaranteed through funding. We can see that very clearly in terms of healthcare, in education, but it hasn't been seen until now in culture, when culture has been declared, and that is another reason why cultural rights are being put on the public agenda. They've been declared a global public good or asset by UNESCO. Culture has been declared an essential good and service in the Spanish legal system. In our book law following the pandemic, in Catalonia, the essentiality of culture was recognized, and it was recognized as an essential good and service also following the pandemic. So when we are talking about essential goods and services, we're talking about goods and services that are essential and linked to fundamental rights. We are talking about essential goods and services in the area of education, because you have the right to education. You're talking about a public health system because it's also an essential service within our rule of law and because it's linked to the right to health. That same logic of constitutional development must exist for culture, and it hasn't been the case. So when I'm saying, answering this question, Marta, what these territories and autonomous communities must do is address these laws governing these public cultural systems. The Canary Islands has already approved it. The Basque Country is working on it. We have the honor of working with the Basque government on the development of this standard, which will be the cornerstone upon which the entire cultural system, not that it'll be built on it, because much has already been built, for example, in the Basque Country, but it will be better governed and organized and created as a system, and everything that has been done in a piecemeal manner will be rethought. Organizing it, and a fundamental piece within these norms and these systems will be the issue of funding. In culture, this is not only one of the issues that is constantly mentioned, but also demanded funding for culture is not sufficient, not effective, or economical. Funding for culture isn't achieving its objectives. So once you have organized culture as a system, you'll be able to identify the unaddressed challenges in terms of cultural rights, and you'll be able to rethink again the public funding system in collaboration with the private system, establishing the roles of public and private sectors precisely to address those neglected challenges that sometimes will have to be covered by the public system or the public sector, but which under certain conditions can also be addressed by the private sector or in public-private collaboration. But it is a wonderful opportunity to create funding systems within the entire cultural system that can guarantee these rights, these cultural rights. And within this regulatory framework to govern, how are you working? How should the participation of different stakeholders be tackled? Of course, the world of culture has many stakeholders. How do they participate? How do citizens participate? How do we give that voice to different interests? And how can it be structured so that it's not top-down, but from the outside, considering the different stakeholders, many avenues can be used, right? The more participatory a standard, the more accepted, the more widely accepted it is, and the better it will be able to be implemented later, right? Therefore, the participatory process in the drafting of laws is crucial. You have different paths and you have different ways of doing it. I can make a comparison, for instance, of what the Ministry of Culture is doing with the Cultural Rights Plan, or what is planned to be done, at least it's intended to be done. It has already happened in the Canary Islands or is potentially there in the Basque Country. The Ministry of Culture has opted for a participation from the creation of texts in a participatory manner from the very beginning, which sometimes leads to the result being technically less than perfect from a strictly legal perspective. But nevertheless, as I was saying, if the goal is to create a political positioning text, then participation from the get-go is interesting. To draft the plan in the ministry, for instance, after this group of experts works on it, or in parallel to this group of experts, a very large public consultation has been held within the public, which is of great interest because it can even lead you to understand or be able to assess to what extent cultural rights are known to the public citizens. It's a test of the knowledge or the level of awareness that Spanish citizens have regarding cultural rights. Why is the level of participation in this very open public consultation conducted by the Ministry of Culture going to give you that information? I see this participatory process more as a first step towards creating a good political document that can later serve as guidelines. When drafting a regulation, I understand that it has to stem from a text generated from the technical standpoint with well-established legal concepts, which then has to be implemented. Not only then, but also in parallel, it has to be subject to scrutiny by all stakeholders of the cultural fabric, both private and public, precisely to reach those contexts, those criteria, and those legal institutions. So depending on how a city council or a city wants to move forward, it can move forward along one of these two lines to create a standard, a public cultural system based on a standard. I believe we need to be more careful about legal terminology and concepts, because in the end, that's what the guarantee scheme will ensure. If they're not well conceived, the guarantees won't be effective. If what we want is to start working on cultural facts or cultural rights, creating an action plan seems the right thing to me. And then within our own special Spain and unique territorial configuration in Spain. We have the municipal level, we have the autonomous communities, but what's the role of the state in all of this? The truth is that we live in a very, very disaggregated state with a very complex structure, like you were saying. What good practices, what good examples can you share with us, with our audience, those three levels? The local level, because cultural activities are exercised by municipalities, and at the regional level, and at central state administration level. Well, first, we must also highlight another aspect that has been included in the Constitution regarding culture, and that is that culture is the only power shared by the three levels. There is no exclusive power over culture. Rather, the constitutional framework created was one of shared powers. Everyone must be committed to promoting culture, including the state, the autonomous communities, and the local governments. In fact, Article 149 of the Spanish Constitution states something very beautiful, which is that the state will facilitate cultural communication. There's another shortcoming there, right, within the state. Why? Because we don't have a basic state cultural communication law that creates that harmony of the different legal frameworks on culture that perhaps should exist among all the autonomous communities. We haven't been able to create that communication framework, but it's true that we don't have a regulation, but in practice we do have something. We have sectoral councils, we have roundtables where all the autonomous communities and the state meet to discuss culture. That's a good initiative, which falls a little short because from our viewpoint, we would need to have that cultural communication law to harmonize, or just as we were talking about harmonization in the European Union precisely to guarantee European rights and freedoms that are designed in a similar way in all territories, we should be able to create this cultural communication law in our state. We have councils, we have spaces where they communicate, but we've fallen a little bit short at state level. In the autonomous communities, there are good practices, as I was saying, laws, the action plan at the state level is true. Good initiatives in the autonomous communities. I like to highlight the laws that are being promoted now. We know that there are some autonomous communities that are also thinking about doing that, and at the municipal level, there are so many citizen participation councils, and I believe that the municipality is where we can really go into more detail about the guarantee of the right to participation in the programming of neighborhood cultural activities and the programming of cultural policies at municipal level. There are councils, but perhaps we could also make some progress in regulatory areas in the context of the municipality, right? Of course, many city councils are reforming their municipal participation regulations. The cultural regulations are always a space that are very exciting. We must also remember that in addition to the recognition of culture as a global public good at the UNESCO level, due to the Spanish presidency of the European Commission, there was a meeting of ministers of culture here in Spain, in Cáceres, where they drafted what's called the Cáceres Declaration on Culture. And in the Cáceres Declaration on Culture, all the ministers of the European Union recognize, in addition to recognizing culture as a basic good of prime necessity, they speak of the obligation to promote culture at the center of public policies, which is what we call the essentiality of culture and the centrality of culture. Culture must be placed at the center of public policies, just as gender policies are. Culture should always be included, for instance, in a municipal land use plan. If we're going to create new land use planning instruments, we have to consider how that planning will guarantee cultural rights. And this is very important at the municipal level. How will this planning consider the existence of infrastructure for the right to participation, the right to access culture, and the right to artistic creation? So, putting cultural policies at the center is exactly that. When you're talking about funding, how do you fund culture? Because let's not forget that in Spain, in our constitution, in the preamble, it says that the Spanish nation is committed to ensuring the economic and cultural development of people, meaning that it must be placed at the center of all economic policies. It must be placed at the center. We've seen this in gender policies, right? Even in Spain, some municipal planning was cancelled because the gender perspective wasn't considered within that planning instrument. Well, the same happened with culture. If we're going to legislate, culture must be at the center. When we're talking about municipal planning, how do we organize that municipality? From the point of view of roads and healthcare, education, but also from the cultural perspective. Exactly the same thing happened because they are all basic services. So all that development is what we're still lacking in Spain. We still have a lot of room for improvement. I love this. I love thinking about urban planning, participation, and cultural promotion, because the truth is that urban planning policy, you're totally right, is a neglected area. Yeah, it's truly the terrain where these cultural rights will be effectively, efficiently, and finally guaranteed. So if we don't have cultural infrastructure, how will the right to access be guaranteed? If we don't have the capacity within municipalities to fund or promote culture, how will these rights be guaranteed? And we've been told in the Cáceres Declaration that we must put culture at the center of public policies in a cross-sectional way, not just in a fragmented, biased and sectoral way, right? And in the context of this entire project in which you're so involved, the comparative perspective of Spain with other countries, I mean, if you had to explain it to everyone listening to us, where do we stand? How are we doing in this process of ensuring that culture is at the center of public life? I can't do a comparative study here on everything, but I do want to mention my feelings. Exactly. I do want to mention the Ibero-American space. We often believe that in Spain we are more advanced in terms of cultural rights, and that's not the case at all. In countries like Colombia, for example, there has been a lot of progress. There are constitutions in Latin America as modern as ours, and they have much more regulatory development in the sense we are mentioning than we do. So we have to look closely at Latin America and see what they are doing about this issue. I love that perspective, that very perspective you're putting forward, Patricia, because in the participatory group, almost 80% of our members are municipalities and regions from Latin America. In participation, they've been ahead of us for many years, right? So I love your vision that we still have the burden of, hey, let's go to regions to teach. It's quite the opposite, right? But from a constitutional perspective, in the field of urban planning, for instance, the concept of the social and ecological function of land and the added value of participation is much more deeply rooted in the regions than in our constitutions, which, as you were saying, it's a young constitution, but it's been around for a few years. So as a final assessment, your perception of the need to enrich from other systems and cultures is precisely essential, not to fall into a self-reinforcing cultural inbreeding that ultimately ends up empty, right? You've given a vision that I really liked, that need for a transversality of culture and how it should be at the heart of public policy intervention in a participatory manner, right? How actors, when we do this map of participation stakeholders in our master's program, it's true That culture is a big forgotten axis. We incorporate environmental, business, health, and education stakeholders, but culture is never at the center. So I think bringing you here was aimed precisely at shedding light on something that is absolutely essential and crucial not only for our society but to our society's progress. So thank you so much for the way you summarized it and presented it. It's a delight to have you here. I wanted to mention something. Participation is intrinsic to culture. In fact, Article 27 of the Universal Declaration, when speaking of culture, speaks of the right to participate in cultural life. In other words, it's the foundation and the core. You can't talk about culture without speaking about participation, because culture is truly what we create together. Exactly. So that cultural heritage of a people, the concept of culture encompasses all of this. Yeah, all the tangible and intangible means in which we live, which make us who we are. It's not just the concept of culture restricted to high culture, as one might say. Isn't it true that participation is key? I totally agree. We need to talk about urban planning and about participation, about the right to culture, because we often don't realize it, but it happens to us in the workshops we carry out with experts. If we don't adopt a comprehensive perspective, a holistic perspective, in the end, these key elements of our social dynamics are left out, and participation has to be mainstreamed into all of it. And culture, in the end, it's what saves us, as Helderlin would say. In other words, it's the area where we are really who we are. Thank you so much, Patricia. We'll organize another program, and everybody who's listening to us, remember, without culture, there's no participation, and without cultural participation and without culture, there is no society. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.